say they're a complete beginner, okay, work on your static flexibility, because that's the key to more dynamic flexibility. So yeah, thanks for having me, fellas. Appreciate it.
Delighted to have you.
Absolutely delighted to have you. Obviously, you're putting out some great stuff there on Instagram, and that's kind of where we came across you in at the beginning, like, you know. So, obviously, you've got a martial arts background as well yourself. Do you want to start off with just kind of telling us a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So I've been doing martial arts now for about a little over 30 years, showing my age now. I started about the age of 5 or 6. I lived in America for a long time, so I got to train under guys like Bill Wallace, Joe Lewis. Bill obviously has a great background in physiology and flexibility, and he brought that into his lessons, and that's really where my interest in flexibility came from. You know, since then I've, you know, gotten black belts in a couple of styles, including ITF. Competed nationally, internationally, taught the England karate team for a few years. I've been a professional flexibility coach now for about 22 years. Started off doing like dedicated flexibility classes as an assistant instructor in like the Taekwondo clubs in the karate schools. And that's kind of what I spend most of my time doing now, is more of the flexibility than the martial arts, but kind of everything that I do with flexibility is like engineered or slanted towards people who, you know, need those extreme ranges of motion, martial arts, dancers. You know, there's a lot of crossover between the disciplines. So at the minute I'm not really, like, I do my own training, but not really training like properly martial arts at the minute.
Really cool. That's a nice background to have, obviously. And do you think that that's kind of what got you into the flexibility side, working with the likes of Bill Wallace, who obviously is a phenomenal kicker and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, like he says, kicking people in the head is fun.
We can attest.
Absolutely. But I mean, so I've always had that interest with Bill, but kind of my interest really took off in the late 90s, because I attended a few seminars with Tom Kurz, the guy who wrote Stretching Scientifically. And you'll find that a lot of the stuff I talk about, you'll find his influence there as well. So it's kind of mixing what Bill said and what Tom said and kind of melding them together. But yeah, like I say, Bill's, you know, I owe Bill a lot. He's a great guy. And, you know, you'll see on my Instagram, there's quite a few videos there of the crazy stuff he could do with his left leg.
But, you know, but that's actually an interesting point as well, because I know it's going to come up later in the conversation, but he had an impingement on his right side as well, didn't he? He couldn't, well, it's not that he didn't have the flexibility, he had the flexibility, but he had a physiological issue on his right-hand side.
Yeah, so he actually got into karate because of a judo accident. He was in the Air Force and they were doing, I think it was osotogari, which is like a hip throw, and his opponent landed on his right leg. He blew out his MCL, which is the ligament on the inside of the knee. And while he was recovering, he saw a karate school. I think he was based in Japan at the time. So he started training in karate, and he had a natural level of flexibility anyway, because he was a wrestler at high school. And the kind of training they do, you know, they train full range of motion with load, which you see is becoming more popular these days.
Yeah.
So Bill always had that kind of high level of flexibility anyway, and he applied it to karate, and he could only use his left leg. And, you know, he was always like, the surgery back then wasn't great. You know, we're talking like early to mid 60s. So he chose to just kick with his left leg. And it wasn't some genetic freak. He, you know, he worked hard. He'd be throwing like 10, 15,000 kicks, you know, a day, you know, which is, you know, ridiculous, you know, repetitions. But he was in the military, and, you know, he basically get paid to train for hours and hours a day, you know. But yeah, he basically took advantage of a handicap, and could kick better with one leg than most people at the time could kick with two, you know. But interestingly, his influence for learning to kick the way he does is a guy called Skipper Mullins, who was a Taekwondo guy. I think he may have been a student of June Rhee, but I'm not 100%. But yeah, he had a bit of a Taekwondo influence as well. So it's kind of
it's in there from place to place.
I know, and it's kind of come full circle, because obviously, if you look at the way ITF fighters compete and spar, it's very similar to how Bill did it back in the 60s. You know, the high chamber, the repetitive kicking with one leg, and now obviously Olympic style is starting to adapt to that as well. but we won't go on talk about the Olympic style.
We're happy to talk about everybody.
Yeah.
There's lessons to be learned from everyone.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Olympic style isn't what it was, unfortunately. It's great that they've got the front leg influence in there, but the rule set is just so restrictive. And in my opinion, it's just not fun to watch anymore. But, so Bill had a bit of a Taekwondo influence as well, which is great.
And for yourself then, was it, did you is it something you went and studied, or was it just like through self-learning, or how did it all begin?
Yeah. So obviously I took the material from guys like Bill. He wrote a few books, as did Tom Kurz as well. But I actually went to university and got my bachelor's and master's degrees in kinesiology, which is the science of human movement. And my specialism was in clinical biomechanics. So kind of looking at how the body moves and how it deals with the forces during training. And flexibility, a lot of people don't realize, is a subset of biomechanics, because you're assessing how much the body can move and deal with forces through that range. So my focus during my degrees was on flexibility. Obviously, I'm a certified strength and conditioning coach as well, so there's an aspect there as well.
Crossover,
with that. Yeah, absolutely. So I've studied at a degree level, hoping one day to complete a PhD in like the biomechanics of flexibility as well. But the way things are going at the minute, it's all just a bit crazy, with the lockdown, and we don't know what's going on. So maybe one day, but right now, just trying to focus on finishing my book.
How's that going?
Long and slow. Yeah. It's just a lot to cover. I'm trying to make it so that it's an academic textbook that gets accepted into universities, but also anybody who's not interested in the science can just drop into it and learn what they need to learn to get as flexible as need to as quickly as possible. All these guys like Tom and Bill, they've been great influences, but what I've found over the years is there's gaps in the knowledge or in the material that they've written, and what I'm trying to do is kind of fill those gaps, so it's like almost an encyclopedia of flexibility.
Nice. That was a nice segue into what I was going to ask you next. Actually, I was just kind of wondering, would you say that like the likes of Bill and those guys, that their methods have kind of like stood the test of time and through the research and things like that?
Yeah, they have. I mean, so Tom Kurz is the guy who popularized the idea that you need to do dynamic stretching before dynamic activities, which is absolutely right. But he was also quite against the idea of doing static stretching during a warm-up. And if you find which is, Bill's preference was to do static stretching during a warm-up. So you kind of look at them both, and they both got great flexibility, but they both speak in sense. You kind of think, well, where do I go with this? And the answer is a bit of both. So obviously, when people look at the research in static stretching, they see that there's quite a bit of confusion. And what it tended to be was that in the sort of 1990s to early 2000s, the studies were looking at static stretching before a dynamic activity, say a max effort jump or a lift, and they were seeing decrements in performance. And then that kind of got absorbed into the greater public's knowledge, and suddenly static stretching decreases performance, potentially is risky for injury. But if you look at those studies, they were quite flawed, and they weren't doing warm-ups. They were holding the stretches for minutes at a time. They weren't using stretches that were specific to the activity. They were doing the testing almost immediately after the stretch, where there's research which has shown that if you do a static stretch and then walk around for 5 minutes, any negative effects are completely offset. So there's a Canadian researcher called David Benn who has really drilled down into static stretching, and he's shown that if you do static stretching to like a level of say 7 out of 10 in terms of discomfort for no more than 60 seconds per muscle group, and then follow it up with sport specific dynamic stretches, then your performance increases and the chance of injury is actually very, very small.
Is that kind of short term or long term, as in for that session, or kind of like progressing on?
Yeah, so the increases in flexibility following the static stretching will be short term. Okay, will be temporary. You'd still need to. So the way you would set a session up is, so say you have a student who can't kick above the waist without doing, static stretches. Mm-hmm. So you do your general warm up, get the blood pressure, the the heart rate and the temperature up. Do some static stretching for the muscles that are going to be used. Follow that with some progressive dynamic stretching like leg raises. Do the session, and then at the end, during the cool down, you would do, long duration static stretches or isometric stretches as well. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of way you put it together. So it's kind of like Tom and Bill were both right. The way we're seeing it now with the research is it's both basically. Both were correct.
I think Tom even went into that, to some degree in his Science of Sports Training, or the one that looked more at periodization, the timing mm-hmm. of the training. It was a bit more detailed than the very popular like stretching scientifically. Mm-hmm. But it's a bit like people who look at Verkhoshansky or something like that. It's great to have it on your shelf, but it's not nice to read it.
No. Super Training is a hell of a read, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like trying to drill into something like that is not for the faint of heart. And, so people will take, as you said, the news bites. And I think what was interesting for me, I've actually, to show the age as well, it's the same kind of timeline. So I went and did my degree from from 99 to 2003, and that was when I would have been looking at this on an academic level. And still the majority of the texts that were quoted at the time were looking at the Pope study in Australia in the 60s that was looking at like thousands of soldiers doing a bit of stretching and then seeing what happened in terms of their rate of injury. But they were marching and they were carrying back loads. It was completely unusual stuff, but it's still referenced right up until the 90s as as shown in Pope so, but it's interesting how the focus of the studies has changed over time. So at one point in time it was what increases range of motion, and then it became what prevents or reduces risk of injury, and then it goes to what has less of an impact on performance, so in terms of decreasing performance, to then what increases performance. So when you compare all of these methods and almost research philosophies over time, what stands the test of time in your opinion?
That's a good one. To be honest, I think research still has a long way to go. We're still not there in terms of finding the answer. It's like, I did a post on Instagram recently where it kind of showed a timeline of the belief of static stretching, for example. I'll use static stretching for now because it's the one that everybody knows and everybody can do. And like you say, in the 50s and 60s, it was, flexibility increases range of motion, prevents injuries. Then we get to the 90s to 2000s, and it's, static stretching, the massive injury risk, it doesn't increase performance. And then we've kind of come full circle again where it's, it's a little bit of both. And it's like, I think the way it's going to go forward is, flexibility training is going to incorporate all methods. The ideal training program is going to include dynamic stretching, static stretching, isometric and strength training, eccentrics as well, which is still an area that hasn't really been studied that well. But if you extrapolate the information from eccentric strength training, you find that people are increasing range of motion as a side effect. So that itself will be a great stretching method. But like you say, Tom's material, he produced Stretching Scientifically, I think first published in the 85, and he's done a few editions since then, and it still works. As far as I'm concerned, the material that stands the test of time the most is definitely Tom Kerr's. Human physiology hasn't changed in 10,000-15,000 years, and his ideas still stand the test of time today, absolutely. But I don't think there's ever going to be a kind of catch-all method for everyone, because at the minute, isometric stretching is getting a lot of attention. It's been around for a long time, but it's getting a lot more publicity. There's people who cannot and will not do isometric stretching, so you have to find a way that works for them. So really, I think, the material that's in Tom's book, there's something in there for everyone. But again, there's also gaps in it as well, which, this is why I'm trying to write this book, to try and, plug those gaps. But I think, the approach that everybody could take is number one, you have to increase your static range of motion. And number two, do your dynamic stretches to increase your dynamic flexibility within that static range of motion, because static range of motion always exceeds, dynamic. So if you don't work on your static, regardless of how you do it, whether it's static stretching, isometric stretching, or both, you're never going to have dynamic flexibility without static.
Raising the ceiling.
I think that answers your question. I'm not sure. I tend to go off on a tangent.
That's all right.
I think a nice way to go after that would actually be, I seen a post you had recently that stated that flexibility does not equal range of motion.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So this is a big one. And so, flexibility is often called range of motion. So how far a joint can move. And it's not wrong per se, but we could be more accurate with the definitions that we're using. Because, the kind of the words that we use and the language we use affects what we do in training. So flexibility and range of motion aren't the same thing. Like flexibility is a motor ability. And range of motion is how you measure that motor ability. So motor ability is a component of somebody's overall ability to move, and you have several of them. Strength is a motor ability, endurance, power, speed, agility, motor control, all these things that we would say are components of physical fitness. When you put them all together, you get an idea of somebody's overall movement quality. And so a more accurate definition of flexibility would be it's somebody's ability to display as much of a position as possible. Because when you look at movement, it's essentially transition between positions. So if you take a side kick, for example, when somebody does it at full speed, it's one fluid movement. But if you break it down, it's transitioning from ready stance to chamber, from chamber to extension, then extension back to chamber and back to ready stance. And in biomechanics, the word motion means to change position. Therefore, range of motion would be a measurement in change of a joint's position from one point to another. Does that make sense?
I think that's an important thing to actually go into, because a lot of time the terms are kind of used interchangeably, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, language is a dynamic, it's a dynamic thing. So there is going to be some degree of interchangeability. Flexibility and mobility is another one. And you can forgive kind of the confusion between the terms if people aren't reading the research. It's it's understandable. And at the end of the day, when you're in the dojang or the gym, it's not a laboratory. You're not inclined to use clinical language. The issue we've got, however, is in the last 10 years, there's been a massive rise in people who know the clinical research, and I don't know whether it's through ignorance or whether they're actually doing it on purpose, they're blurring the lines between the language. Whether it's to try and push what they're doing ahead of everyone else, I don't know. And the issue we get is because we live in quite a tribalistic society, people kind of latch onto an idea, and they start saying, well, for example, flexibility and mobility, there's been this reverse engineer of the terminology where people are now saying flexibility has always been synonymous with passive range of motion only. And then people are latching onto that, saying, well, you're doing flexibility, so you're only doing passive training. It's like, well, how do you explain dynamic flexibility?
Yeah.
I think, we've got that very recent example of that, which again, I think it just kind of tipped off there in the early 2000s, but the self-myofascial release, foam rolling, etc., to where, it didn't really sit well with flexibility training, or it didn't sit well with the terminology that was being used at the time. So it became mobility training. Then it was like, it doesn't matter what the word actually means. It's just that we need to be different. We need to sell a product that's different. And so we're going to be training mobility, not flexibility. Absolutely. So it becomes something a little different then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that, sorry, I was just going to say on that point, do you think that the mobility itself is the difference between the passive and the active range? Would that be fair to say?
Well, I mean, the thing about mobility, when you look at the literature, the scientific literature, and my argument is we need to be as evidence-based as possible, so that we're using as much of the good science as possible, and not just making stuff up as we go along. In martial arts, it's famous for it. There's so much bullshito out there that you've seen the videos online where you've got people doing cheap blast knocks out. Yeah, absolutely. No touch knockouts. And you kind of getting a degree of that with the research, and and physical training. Like if you look at mobility, like the word itself in the clinical research means to be able to move your body from point A to point B without without risk of injury and without expending massive amounts of energy. So can you get there safely and efficiently? So can you get up out of a chair and walk to a spot across the room without falling over or gassing out? And that's why we say people who can't do that have poor mobility. And that's why Zimmer frames, walking sticks, scooters called mobility aids. And that's in about 90% of the research. That's how that term is used. In about the other 10%, the term joint mobility actually means the quality of movement within the joint itself. So, say you have take the hip joint, which is a ball and socket joint. It's examining how well those bony surfaces move relative to each other within the joint. There's a term called arthrokinematics. Arthro meaning joint and kinematics meaning the study of motion, and it deals exclusively with accessory motions, which is the spins, rolls, and glides of the joint surfaces, which we have no voluntary control over. And you can so that kind of joint mobility can be inhibited by pathologies in the joint capsule, like fibrosis, for example, in the joint capsule. And it's addressed by mobilizations and manipulations, which is another person imparting a force into the joint, or you can do it yourself with a resistance band. And Kelly Starrett, the guy who wrote Supple Leopard, so he's popularized that method of mobility by using bands to kind of change the position of the joint, the bony segments within the joint capsule. That's joint mobility. Yeah. When it comes to like measuring range of motion or anything that affects, range of motion, like voluntary range of motion, it's flexibility, and there are different types of flexibility. And I think that's the issue people have, is they think flexibility is just this one encompassing thing, but like you have strength, you've got speed, strength, and so on. There are different types of flexibility as well. In fact, there's 4 types, and the kind of what you're trying to develop will affect the kind of training that you're going to do. So really mobility, again, if we're using the language from the research, you're only going to address mobility if people have got a pathology within the actual joint capsule, or if somebody can't walk without a walking stick.
Yeah. So what would you say then would be the difference between the active and the passive range? Is it to do with strength or control, or?
Yeah, so so there's 4 types of range of motion, and there's 4 types because we have 2 types of stretch reflex, and there's 2 things that a muscle can do physiologically. So the 2 stretch reflexes are the dynamic stretch reflex and the static stretch reflex. The dynamic stretch reflex happens instantaneously, and it subsides within like a fraction of a second. And then a weaker static stretch reflex continues afterwards. So that muscle is sensing the stretch. It continues for as long as that stretch is held. So the first 2 types of flexibility are dynamic flexibility and static flexibility. The 2 things that muscles can do physiologically is either it can contract or it can relax. That's it. It can't do anything else really. And the words that we use in science to describe a contraction is active, and to describe a muscle that's relaxed, we use the word passive. So the 4 types of flexibility are dynamic, static, active, and passive. But we can go one step further with the definitions, because those things don't happen on the road. They're not mutually exclusive. You can't have movement without the muscle doing something. It's either going to contract or relax. So you combine them to create even more specific names for flexibility. So dynamic active flexibility is when the joint is moving and there's a muscular contraction. Dynamic passive is when the joint is moving but there's no contraction. So that could be, say, at the end of a training session, you're lying on your back, your legs raised in the air, you completely relaxed, and your partner is holding the leg fully supported, doing gentle oscillations, just gently stretch, say the hamstring, for example. So that's dynamic active and dynamic passive. Then you can probably guess the next one's static active. Is when the joint isn't moving and there is a muscular contraction. So say you're doing moo moo and you hold your leg up in the air, the side kick. So the joint's stationary, but the muscles are contracting. You see, that's static active. And static passive is, as you probably guessed, you're not moving, your muscles aren't contracting. You just sat in a stretch, just relaxing. Tom Kurz would call that relaxed stretching.
Right. Okay.
So the type of stretching you do develops a type of stretching. It develops a type of flexibility it's named after. So you want to develop dynamic active flexibility, you do dynamic active stretching. There is some crossover between them, but generally the one that it's named for will develop it. So static passive flexibility is best developed by static passive stretching. Does that answer that question?
Definitely, yeah. And I think the difference as well is like the different type of kicking between, we say, a side kick in sparring versus a side kick in patterns. Obviously, they're probably different ranges and different, like as you said, more active than another one, or more dynamic possibly than the other one.
Different postural control too.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned strength. There is another way you can describe flexibility as well, and it's more to describe how the motor abilities that I talked about before kind of blend together, because again, nothing in the body happens in complete isolation. So there's flexibility, strength. So like we said before, you've got speed, you've got strength, speed, strength, endurance. I think Tom even talks about this in the science of sports training. So you've got flexibility, strength, flexibility, endurance, flexibility, speed, and so on. And those names are more to kind of measure the second attribute through the range. So flexibility, strength, for example, you've got somebody who is doing a Romanian deadlift. So that obviously they're training strength through range. So you're getting to measure how much load they can move and how far they can move it. So then that's a measure of their flexibility, strength. That's if you just wanted to combine the two. If you were working on so you had a student who was working on, turning kicks, for example, in sparring, and you were working on both height and speed, you're developing flexibility, speed there. It's still dynamic active flexibility. But if the focus is more on speed, it's more of a flexibility, speed focus. So does that answer that question?
Yeah, definitely.
I tend to go, I love this subject and I tend to waffle, so just call me out if I do.
Oh, that's very good.
Okay. Yeah. But in terms, I think you asked before, about strength and its relationship to the active types of flexibility. Yeah, I mean, strength is the key. Again, there's carryover between the different motor abilities, but really, especially as adults and people who start training in any discipline as adults, strength is going to be your key. Isometric stretching, which is where you stretch and then contract the muscles, is something like 250% more effective than just normal static passive stretching, and it develops strength through the range of motion. Loaded stretching, which is where you do the movements with weight, it's super effective. And for adults, especially as our body changes with age, we are going to need that essentially. You will get people who don't want to do it. They've got an aversion to strength training and that's their choice, but they're not going to get very far with it. But strength absolutely has an intimate relationship with flexibility.
When you talk about strength, then like a lot of people would say, I'm building strength in my legs, such as through squats and things like that. But are we talking a little bit more specific, as in maybe like isometric holds and things like that, or is it overall strength? Obviously, there needs to be a foundation.
It depends on what the goal is. If somebody's trying to work towards a side split, which is essentially a wide low squat, and they've never trained before, you would get them just doing a normal, back squat, for example, until they can do that with quite a substantial load, and then gradually widen the stance, going, for example, to a sitting stance and doing it that way. And that's how you can increase range and strength at the same time. If you have somebody who's trying to perfect moo, for example, we use that again, and they can't hold the leg up in the air, then the way that you can train that is stick a weight on the end of the leg, an ankle weight, and have them hold the leg up at waist height. Do leg raises, for example. That's another one. But something that I think anybody who incorporates strength into their flexibility training, and martial arts especially, need to do is to work on strength for the back, because when you kick, whether you're kicking pads or kicking somebody in the face, or you're doing those slow extensions of the kicks, there's a lot of force going through the lower back, and it needs to be strong enough to be able to deal with those forces. So starting somebody off with back extensions, good mornings, like I said before, Romanian deadlifts are a great way to start building that strength. So that's something that everybody should do. And you tend to find that the more strength somebody has centrally, the more flexibility they're going to get peripherally. It's this, I don't like it because he uses the word mobility, but it's this catchphrase which says proximal stability equals distal mobility. What it means is that the more stability and more strength you have centrally in your torso, in your back, and your core, the more freedom of movement you're going to have in your peripheral joints, so your shoulder, your hip, your knees, your ankles.
Like with any way of training, you're looking for the rate limiters. So what are the things that stop me progressing and force me to plateau in places? And sometimes it is, as you said, it is the muscular attachments onto the lower spine that cause you to back out of the training, or to stop, to limit what you can do, because once that lower back pain kicks in, you're done. There's nothing else happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a common misconception as well with the whole idea of kicking in particular, is when somebody's looking to, we say, increase the height of a kick, they forget that all the muscles are connected through a chain. So obviously your standing leg is quite important, the flexibility in your standing leg as well as your core and up and into your posture and things like that, So I think that's something that maybe people might just focus on one particular area to get a result in a higher kick, but there's the whole chain involved, of course.
Absolutely. So there's two ways to approach it. You've got the whole kind of the chain of the body, head to toe, needs to be developed equally, because we talked before about how flexibility affects muscle, affects injury. Injury is multifactorial, and one of those is muscular imbalances. That's as big a contributor to injury as lack of range of motion. Developing the body head to toe in balance it shouldn't just be a martial artist goal. It should be a people goal. And also I talked before about those motor abilities. When they combine, you get a picture of somebody's movement quality. So say somebody tries to develop strength, power, endurance, speed, etc., but they don't work on, say, balance or motor control, they're going to have a sloppy, uneven kick. They're going to be falling over. So they need to be developing all that together at the same time as well. Kind of like a chain. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that, because you find these days with obviously posture is not great with people sitting down a lot and all that. Do you find that people maybe anterior pelvic tilt or something actually restricts people's potential to be flexible and have higher kicks and things?
For static flexibility, no, or for static passive flexibility, so sitting in splits, because as you spread your legs, you need to be able to tilt your pelvis anteriorly to create space in the joints, so that the greater trochanter, which is, it's like a bony attachment on the outside of the hip. It's the thing you feel when you poke the side of your thigh that most people think is the hip. It's actually a bony attachment for some of the hip muscles that will jam into the neck of the acetabulum and the pelvis. So the way that you get around that is you rotate the pelvis to create space for it. So it's a benefit in that sense. But if somebody has a dysfunctional posture, that's just going to bleed into every aspect of the life. If you look at physios today, they tend to be saying that posture's fine. There's no such thing as a bad posture, but common sense says there is. Sorry, I forgot to say before, my background, I'm also a sports therapist, so that's kind of like a physio, but more into exercise rehab. Just to put a bit of qualification in there. Sure. So if somebody has a dysfunctional posture, say they sit at a desk all day and they've got a maladaptive pelvic tilt, it's not only going to affect them in their everyday life. When they go into something as intense as martial arts, for example, or weightlifting, whatever they choose to do, as Gray Cook, the guy who wrote, he created the functional movement screen, he wrote the book Movement, as he says, you're just building on top of dysfunction, and eventually something's going to give, because that system isn't tolerating the stresses as it was designed to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So if what I haven't taught martial arts specifically for a while, but what I used to do, especially with the England karate team, is somebody who would come in, they would get a head to toe postural assessment, and then I'd do investigation around anything that I thought was dysfunctional, to see if it was if it was structural or if it was a maladaptive adaptation to some kind of injury, or if it was a guarding posture. I mean, sometimes people might have bad posture because they, they're emotional. There might be an emotional wreck, because emotion is intrinsically tied to posture. So it may be that you get somebody coming into a martial arts class, for example, because they've been bullied and they have this kind of hunched posture because they don't have any confidence. And if you spot that posture, you need to be clued into what their emotional state might be, because you might give instructions when they're doing the pattern to kind of, put your shoulder blades back, chest out, and that can actually cripple them emotionally. Because the way you can change postures, you can do manual therapy, or you can give them cues to try and change it automatically. But there's a bi-directional relationship between posture and emotion. So it's something that I think instructors need to be keenly aware of.
Yeah, we usually think of that from the other side. We're usually asking people to consider their posture towards enhancing confidence, or at least the perception of confidence. So, if you can stand confidently, present yourselves confidently, obviously for pattern performance, it does something in terms of what your opponent sees when you're sparring, it does something. And then for yourself, when you stand confidently, you start to, absorb a little bit of that, as well. But I suppose that it can also, as I said, be a clue. Obviously, it is a clue to how a person is feeling as well. So I just never made the connection to mobility.
Well, I've actually putting something together. It's specifically for ITF Taekwondo instructors, and it's how you can use the traditional technique, like the traditional movements from patterns and from line work, to assess somebody's movement quality. So when they're standing in ready stance, you can assess their posture. You can see, are the toes pointing out or in? Does that give you an idea or an indication to their hip flexibility? If they're in sitting
Standing
stance.
Thomas test.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or, when they're in sitting stance, are their knees collapsing inwards into a valgus? Is that going to have an impact on the way they kick? Are they limiting hip internal rotation? And, if they're in ready stance and they have this kind of rounded shoulder posture, it gives you an indication, okay, they may have had an injury, or they may have a weak back, for example. And then you can kind of, take that and inject it into your training, so that you're tailoring training specifically for their individual needs, what their body needs for that time. Because as we know with martial arts, you have a class of, say, 30 people, 10 people in 3 lines, and you're giving them instructions on what to do. You don't have a great deal of opportunity to tailor the movements for their unique needs or their situation or their physiology. Absolutely. And that's no fault to martial arts. It's it's just it's how we transmit that information to a large group of people. And any good instructor is going to go around and give corrections, etc. But it just having that a slightly more keen awareness of biomechanics and how the forces that are going to be traveling through the tissues are going to affect the body. It just makes it a better experience for the student, and it's going to make them more likely to want to stick around.
Yeah, interesting, definitely. That kind of like brings us on to then the whole idea of like genetics, I guess. Well, like obviously flexibility is a skill if you class it to be similar to speed, strength. These are all skills which can be developed, of course. But what would does that mean that people who use poor range of motion or stiffness as such, and they put it down to genetics, is that an excuse?
It's not an excuse. It's just it is definitely a factor for some people. If we're talking about genetic variances in collagen, for example, some people, men especially, have more collagen than women. Talking about sex differences, women tend to have greater joint range of motion than men due to anatomical differences, especially in the pelvis. They have less musculotendinous unit stiffness, so that means like greater compliance in the muscles and the fascia and the tendons. And endocrine differences, so hormonal differences, and that's all genetic. It's all determined by genetics. So that tends to be why you'll get a student will come in, a female student, and she's naturally kicking people in the head on a first day. Whereas you might get an older guy come in who's never trained in his life. Yes, some of that will be habit and lifestyle choices, especially if they've been an office worker for 30 years. But with age, especially in men, the ratio of collagen to elastin in the muscles changes, which causes an increased proportion of collagen and protein crosslinks, which basically means that your muscles essentially become thicker and tighter. It can be offset with training. You are going to see some change as you age. It's just natural. And how you age, I think the word actually is senescence, is affected by genetics. But there's an interesting field of study coming out. Well, it's been around for a few years, but it's quite new. It's called epigenetics, and it's how environmental factors trigger, your genetics, basically. So it is genetics in a way. If your limited range of motion is down to genetics, just do what you can with what you've got. At the end of the day, I don't believe people should be using genetics as an excuse. There are genetic reasons for differences in flexibility, but there are tests that you can do to see if you can do the splits, for example. And if you can do the splits, you can kick above your own head. So, I mean, Tom Kurz has obviously popularized the famous side split test where you pop your leg up on a stool at waist height. If you can do that with both legs, you can do the splits. And if you can do the side splits, then, and say if you do a Thomas test as well, you've got normal length of your hip flexors, then you can do front splits as well. You can kick well above your own head.
I think that's like the idea of like it being a skill is the important thing there, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
That no matter where you're at, you can improve it. Like you don't step by step, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, and that. Go on.
I was going to say just, it's a perception thing. It's what you surround yourself with, and it's what the expectations of the group are as well. So if you walk into a typical martial arts class, you'll usually find the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 flexible people. And that's normal as a kind of a demographic dispersion around a martial arts class. But then, you go to a dance class, you go to ballet, you go to gymnastics, and it's like there are 3 or 4 or 5 not flexible people. Because the expectation is, the requirement is, the normal, that baseline normality is different.
Sure.
And I think, that's where, you don't have 25 out of 30 people walk in with a genetic predisposition that stops them from being able to be flexible. You might have it where 2 to 3 out of the 30 walk in who have, those kind of difficulties, and the rest don't have don't necessarily have the training yet, or the discipline, or the consistency, or the appropriate methodology, maybe.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting point, actually. It raises a couple. The first is that you tend to see those demographics in those classes because people may have a females especially may have a genetic predisposition to greater range of motion, especially to have a hypermobile syndrome. So they've got naturally lax joints. They will excel at something that demands a high level of flexibility, like gymnastics or dance. And that's why you'll tend to see more of them in there, because we like to succeed and feel good about ourselves. So we tend to gravitate towards something we're good at. But also, if you go to like a ballet class, for example, and there's, they're 15, 16 years old, those girls have been training since they were 3, 4, 5 years old, at an age when it was possible to manipulate the shape of the joints, so they've had that training experience, which it can actually change the shape of the joints and the length of the ligaments to facilitate greater range of motion. That's why people need to be careful when they look on Instagram and they see somebody doing a 10-minute at-home stretch who's got a background in gymnastics or yoga or ballet. They have that natural level of flexibility, and they're pulling off postures and movements that normal guy, a grown man is never good anatomically is impossible, because he wasn't training at an age.
I mean, you've got that. It's the Instagram effect. So, I mean, in the end, if you've got a physique, you can sell any diet or training program. It doesn't really matter whether or not it works, because you look good. It's the same. If you can stand there, and stick your foot to heaven, you've got, my flexibility program clearly works, and you can sell anything. People are not in the business of validating and fact checking.
Absolutely. And it's just something, buyer beware. I mean, at the end of the day, people can choose to follow who they want. They can choose to do whatever program they want, but they need to have realistic expectations. And this isn't to kind of, ruin people's days if they had hopes of being able to kick straight up in the air. But, if your hip joints, aren't structured in a way that's going to be able to let you kick 180 degrees, bearing in mind there's always about 30 to 40 degrees of difference between your maximum passive range of motion and your active range of motion, simply because, like to reach your maximum anatomical range of motion, you need to sit in a split, for example, for 2-3 hours, and your nervous system will gradually give you more. So, and most people never actually reach that limit. So there's always that kind of that big gap, and you do try to close the gap as much as you can, but typically you're talking about 30 degrees difference. So if somebody can sit in a split at 180 degrees, if that's their limit, they're probably going to be able to kick it at 150 degrees maximum, And we're talking about adults here, not people who train as kids. Yeah. And kicking at 150 degrees is fantastic. That's going to kick most people in the face. That's enough to do your patterns. It's enough to do your sparring. But if somebody's, they see somebody doing it on Instagram and they think, I really want to kick 180 degrees, sorry, but your anatomy is not going to let you. So you just need to be careful.
It's actually one of the most common questions that we get on Instagram is how to achieve the splits. And often, like, first of all, I believe that it's not possible for everybody. Is that true?
It's true, yeah. There is a small number of the population who there's conditions, again, genetics, conditions like Coxa-Vara, where it's the angles of the head of the femur and the neck of the femur and the acetabulum, so the hip socket, are just not designed to facilitate a full split. But again, if you do that 30-second test that Tom Kurz has promoted, where you stick your leg up on a chair at the side, that'll tell you everything you need to do, everything that you need to know. If you can't do that, then it's possible anatomically you can't do the splits, but you can still develop your flexibility to a very high level.
Just for anyone who's maybe listening or watching at home, the test that Dan's talking about there is pretty much, can you put your foot so that both legs are at a 90-degree angle while standing upright? And it's a very, very simple test to do, check with a stool or a table or something next to you. But there's a lot of disappointed people who can do that on both sides and get nowhere near a split because the training is there.
Exactly. And the reason they can't do it is the nervous system is basically saying you're not ready for it, and we have to listen to our bodies. And, the way we can kind of ask the nervous system for permission and for more range is you can sit in a stretch for a while, and after a while you're going to feel that the tension is going to dissipate and you can increase the range a little bit more. I think Pavel Satsulin called it weight and tension. Tom calls it relaxed stretching. Call it whatever you want. Isometric stretching. So PNF is a great way to do it. Or loaded movements. Pick up a weight and do wide squats. That's another great way to do it.
I think the point there is you don't actually need the splits. It's like we were talking about earlier, isn't it? It's just to look cool on Instagram is one of the reasons why people want it. It's not actually necessary to be a decent martial artist as such.
No. You tend to find that if people have been, quite physically active through their life and they've not developed abnormally short muscle, they probably already have the static flexibility that they need. And then they just need to develop the dynamic flexibility in that static range. If you wanted to become a world patterns champion and you need those high kicks and your static flexibility is, say, you can only open your legs to 90 degrees, you need to work towards the splits then. You would need to, to reach 180 degrees, say the angle between your thighs when you're kicking at your own head height is 135, 140 degrees. You can go to 160, 170. It doesn't have to be 180. And even when you look at people's splits, if you see them on video or you take a picture and you actually get out a protractor and you measure the angle, it's about 170, 175.
Yeah.
For a split, it tends to be people who are hypermobile can get the full 180.
Or if you had the top down view, you'd probably see the hip sitting behind the heels slightly,
Yeah.
We've taken plenty of pictures.
Yeah.
We know how to do this.
Yeah.
And that actually brings up another interesting point of, especially for kids, I guess for adults as well. What I see a lot in students is a lot of time that their standing foot won't actually be turned in the opposite direction too much, and it puts that hip alignment out of place. And usually what you might see with that then as well is incorrect foot sword position for a side kick. So you have like the foot facing up.
Yeah.
So do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah. So about when people are doing a side kick, their toes are pointing up towards the ceiling.
And then on the standing foot as well, it's actually might be facing almost in the same direction as the kick. Mm-hmm. They're not actually turning their standing foot, rotating it backwards, you know?
Yeah, so a lot of the time that's down to tight adductors and internal hip internal rotators. So we'll deal with the foot swords first. So say somebody can't internally rotate their toes essentially to get that, that flat foot. You'd have them work on hip internal rotation stretches. In terms of the foot, that's the supporting foot, it tends to be tight adductors. So when the weight is on the foot, the adductors are tightening to stabilize that leg, to try and create as little movement as possible. And when that happens, it's gonna internally rotate the foot. So they're kind of like polar opposites. You've got too much external rotation on the kicking foot and too much internal rotation and adduction on the standing foot. So stretch the hip internal rotators, adductors, and do a test retest. So before they do any stretching, have them do the kick, at whatever speed they want to do, whatever height they can do, and then do that protocol I said before. Do a bit of a warm up, do some static stretching for 30 seconds per muscle group, some dynamic stretches, and see the difference. Retest, and you probably see a massive difference. And that's kind of my foolproof way of knowing if it is due to tightness and it's not structural or anatomical. Is if they stretch and get an improvement in range and position, then it's to do with the soft tissues. It's not structural.
Yeah, because I often see it as well with some kids who are doing gymnastics and dance and things like that. They might actually have so much flexibility that they can just put their leg in the air so easy. They don't actually have to get that rotation and the hip alignment as such.
There's a coordination element there then as well, you see, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it just comes down to especially if they're gymnast or dancer, they're going to have their coordination is going to be off the chart. So I think people compare, especially adults comparing themselves to kids, men comparing themselves to women. Binary opposites. If you do have somebody that you want to compare yourself to, pick somebody your own sex, your own age, ideally your own training background if you can, even your own ethnic group, because there are ethnic differences in flexibility as well. So me, for example, one of my favorite kickers is Master Suska, with his patterns, but again, he's been training since he was young. So he's probably going to have a higher level of natural flexibility than people who didn't. But if it was somebody, say, my size, my gender, I'd look for, a white male, whereas, women should look towards women because your anatomy and physiology is going to be more similar to that demographic. I see a lot of people making the mistake of, a 50-year-old male saying, "Oh, I want to have the flexibility of that 15-year-old female dancer." It's like, do we really need to have that conversation?
Yeah. I guess that's a nice place to bring us then. If everybody was looking to improve their own state, even if it was a little bit or whatever, what would be the actionable takeaways you'd be giving them to improve their kicking height and maybe in their control of the ability to kick as well?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, say they're a complete beginner, okay. Work on your static flexibility, because that's the key to more dynamic flexibility. There's no point, if you've got poor static flexibility, trying to do dynamic stretches, you're just going to go beyond, you're going to force the muscles to, your static limit, and the muscle, the nervous system's going to put the brakes on. You're going to get strains, possible tears. You're going to be out of action for ages. So first of all, test your static flexibility, how much you've got, and try to improve that through relaxed stretching, metric stretching, so like PNF, contract relax, CRAC, whatever people want to call it. Work on core strength, do planks, back extensions, anything to strengthen the core, because the stronger your core is, the more force you're going to be able to deal with through the back, and the less injury you're going to get, and two, the more your nervous system is going to say, okay, you're strong enough to deal with this movement. Here's a bit more range, and also, if you wanted to have those slow kicks, practice slow kicks, I see it's the rule of specificity, when it comes, the body will adapt specifically to what you ask it to do. You'll get people who are kicking a heavy bag, full power, and going, why can't I hold my leg up in the air? It's like, hold your leg up in the air.
Yeah.
But again,
the simple answer is the answer.
Need back strength as well. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's extremely relevant as well, because if you want to kick, like I believe personally anyway, you need to incorporate your flexibility and your control work with the kicking exercises once you have that range, because as we said earlier, there's balance involved, there's lots of other things. So that once you have like the foundation level, the more that you can bring it into actual kicking exercises, I think the more transfer that you're going to get.
Yeah. And I mean, anybody who wants to kick with more power, more accuracy, slow your kicks right down. I mean, I'd even say, beginners when they're coming in, until they get to, yellow belt or green, green tag, green stripe, whatever grading. So we're talking sort of like 3 to 6 months in, have them do all the kicks slow and low, because the more you slow the technique down, the bigger demand on the nervous system, and the more your motor control will improve. If you do a technique really quickly, yes, there's going to be more power there, because that's basic biomechanics, force equals mass times acceleration. But if you want better technique and better control, and knowing how to being able to place your foot where you want it, then slow it right down, because you can control it, the more control you're going to have when you speed it up. As Bill Wallace used to say, how slow you can kick is how well you can really kick. I think that's what he used to say. Something along those lines. But he's basically saying, like, how slow you can kick is how you can really kick at the end of the day. And you tend to see that, like, we'll use Master Susker as an example again. He can do those really beautiful slow kicks, but you see him kick a pad and he's almost taking the person's arms off, but the reverse isn't true. You can't really get somebody who's only ever done full power, full speed kicks can do the slow, the placement's quite sloppy. So I'd say, starting off, work on your static flexibility, work on your dynamic flexibility, but also slow the techniques right down, do them slow with control. And then as you get better at that, you'll find that being able to kick with speed becomes a lot easier, but you can't reverse that process, unfortunately.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, because when you think about it, you can see that as well in people that it makes sense, and the people that you can see who can kick well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there any kind of myths you'd like to debunk before we wrap it up? Because I think the flexibility is definitely one of those ones that has plenty of them.
Yeah, flexibility isn't just passive range of motion. There's this, and I'm not going to name names, because people can say what they want and do what they want. But there's this kind of myth that's been going around for a few years that flexibility is, historically synonymous with passive range of motion only. So therefore, if you're training flexibility, you're only training your passive range, and you're not going to have control and strength. It's absolute rubbish. The term flexibility has meant freedom of movement with control around your joints in a scientific literature since about the 1700s. So flexibility is, it's all ranges, with strength, without strength. It's not just sitting in the splits or sitting, reaching for your toes, doing a standing toe touch. It's not just, it's much, much more than that, and to be honest, I think, it could be an entire field of sports science in its own right. There's so much to consider, but if you're stretching and you're not getting anywhere, add strength.
Okay.
That's the hallmark of true flexibility, I think, is having strength through the range.
It's interesting because, coming full circle was a theme earlier in our conversation about how ideas and philosophies on stretching and flexibility training tend to go full circle. But when I think it's probably true for all of us, when we started our martial arts journey, it was almost like the myth that, well, you didn't want to strength train because you'd lose your flexibility, you'd get stiff. And it's almost like now you've come to the point where it's like, well, you almost don't want to do too much flexibility training because you get weak. So it's almost like that's inverted itself.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. At the end of the day, it all depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to increase range and get strong, you're doing, flexibility training. You're just using strength to get there. And you absolutely should be doing strength training. I think, everybody should be doing strength training as a human being. because as you get older, those joints are going to get weaker, the tissues are going to become less robust. And strength training, research, if anything, the research has shown it's that, in pretty much every single case, when people are strength trained, they've offset and even reversed the negative effects of aging or inactivity, and, even martial artists, there's something I found over the years is that somebody will ask me, how do I do the splits? And I say to them, well, how much can you squat? I don't squat. Oh, okay, that's probably why, because you're not developing any strength. Or, they're asking why the wrist is hurting every time they punch a board. For example, if they're doing a board break, or how many knuckle push-ups can you do? 2. Well, it's one of these things. People join, do martial arts to get fit. It's look, you have to be fit to do martial arts. It's extremely taxing on the body, and especially if we talked before, like somebody who's sat at a desk and has, habits of developed bad posture and tightness in certain areas. You're going to have to deal with those before you're going to get where you want to go with the martial arts. I'm not saying people should, stretch and go to the gym before they go to a martial arts class, but they should, whatever their goals are in the martial arts class, bring those down a little bit and then work on, strength and flexibility at the same time. And you'll find that they'll start to progress at the same time, just trying to find that balance.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah. Very good. So before we finish up, we just put it out on Instagram, obviously, to avoid a couple of questions. So we just took 5 of some questions that people had. A lot of these topics we covered already, but if
all right, cool.
We can maybe just give a little bit of a specific answer, maybe for some people. So Ellie was asking, even when I stretch every day, I'm still very stiff when I kick.
Okay. Again, I'd ask, what kind of stretches is Ellie doing? Are the positions specific to, because, flexibility is very specific. It's specific to the joint, to the position and the speed of movement. So say you're trying to do a turning kick or roundhouse kick for the non-Taekwondo listeners. You're going to need flexibility in your adductors and your hamstrings, and say all you're doing is static stretches for your quads. You're not addressing the muscles that are being stressed during that movement. Are the stretches in the correct position? So, the best stretch to do for kicks is a front kick. Is a front split, because if you turn the picture of a kicker on the side, it looks like a front split. And if you are, say, you're just doing static stretches, static passive stretches, relaxed stretches, whatever people want to call them, add some isometric tensions in there. Stretch to as far as you can go comfortably. Tense the muscles that you feel the stretching, relax, and then you'll find that the stretch will slightly increase, and just repeat that. Do weightlifting movements that mimic the stretch. So a weightlifting movement that's very similar to a front split is a Bulgarian split squat. Trying to remember the name of it there.
Yeah,
or if you're, I don't know if Ellie comes from a Taekwondo background, if you do a walking stance or a front stance, if it's karate, with a barbell over your shoulders, it doesn't have to be a massive amount of weight, and just do long lunges in a walking stance so that back foot is turned out. You're going to strengthen those muscles in the same position they're going to be in when you do a kick. And then obviously work on dynamic stretches as well. It tends to be that if you have good static flexibility, but you feel tight and tense when you do dynamic movements, it's because static stretches don't develop dynamic flexibility. Dynamic stretches do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Cool.
This one we kind of covered already, but I suppose if we want to just give a quick summary, Jonty asks advice on foot sword formation and how to improve height of kick.
How to improve foot sword formation. So again, look at any kind of restrictions in hip internal rotation, which is, if you're standing, it's being able to point your toes inwards. A traditional technique that I used to do to improve my foot sword was to walk on the outside of my feet. So walking on the foot sword, that'll certainly strengthen that position. What was the second part of the question?
And how to improve kicking height.
Kicking height. Again, improve your static flexibility and then work your dynamic stretches within that range. So, if you just want to do a standalone workout for dynamic flexibility for the height of your kicks, do some joint rotations to loosen yourself up, do a 10-15 minute cardio warm-up, get your temperature up, do 30 to 60 second static stretches for the front and side splits, do leg raises to the front, side, and back, and then finish with longer duration front and side split stretches. That's a dynamic flexibility workout in a nutshell, basically.
Nice, cool. Ida asks, will stretching after strength training negatively impact that strength work that you
Absolutely not. No. Research shows that if you do something called interset stretching, so say you do, I'll use bicep curls because it's a movement everybody knows. Say you do bicep curls and then you do bicep stretches in between each set. Research has shown that strength and hypertrophy, so how much muscle growth there is, increases. And also static stretching after strength training has shown to relieve muscular soreness, muscle cramps, stiffness the day after. So no, it absolutely doesn't.
Next one comes from Jess. She asks, should I foam roll and how does it work? As in, what are the goals of foam rolling?
Okay, so research has shown that foam rolling can increase flexibility for about 20 minutes after the foam rolling or after the exercise, without reducing performance. So if you're finding that your static stretches before dynamic stretches aren't having much of an effect, you could try foam rolling. For some people, it feels good. Do it if it feels good as well. What was the question? I'm going off exam.
Yeah, so should you do it for martial arts training, and like what would your goals be with that?
Okay, yeah. So I mean, the way you could do it is do multiple sets of say 30 to 60 seconds per muscle group. So 1 to 2 sets of about 30 seconds each. At about 50 to 90% of your maximum pain tolerance. You don't want it to be, because foam rolling tends to be uncomfortable for quite a lot of people because you're putting that pressure through the tissues. So don't go too hard, but so that you can feel some pain. Yeah, absolutely. And whether you should use it or not, it depends if you get an effect from it. The greatest tool in your toolbox at the end of the day is trial and error. So many people message me and ask, should I do this? Should I do that? And my answer is try it and see. If you foam roll at the start of a session and you find that your flexibility has gone off the charts, foam roll. If you are sore after every workout, foam roll and takes that away, reduces the soreness, foam roll. If you don't get anything from it, like Bruce Lee says, throw it out. It's it's effective, it works, but it's not a panacea. It's not a it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. Nothing is at the end of the day.
We'll do one more. Tati asks the difference between dynamic and static.
Okay, dynamic is moving, static isn't. That's it. Yeah. Perfect.
So that was fantastic. Do you want to give it just a quick plug on maybe I know you've working on a book at the moment and you've an Instagram page as well that's quite active.
Yeah. So my Instagram page it's at flexibility.research. I've got a website coming soon. Going to be launching my own podcast soon as well, where I'm just going to be sharing all the latest research with everyone. And it's not just going to be a copy and paste of research papers. It's going to be how you apply this in your training. Dispelling a lot of myths in there, answering, and people will be able to ask questions as well. The book's probably still a good 12 months off, just with other projects I've got going on. I've been writing it for a few years now, but it's, it's one of those, it's a lot of work, and I'll have to be writing constantly, every day, and I've just got other stuff to do as well. So that I'll make announcements closer to the time, but hopefully going to get the podcast. It's going to be called Flexibility Focus, coming out in the next month. So yeah, just go to my Instagram page if you want to connect. Cool. That's where I am on most of the time. Yeah,
we'll throw that link in the description of the video anyway, so people will be able to find you. So absolutely brilliant, Dan. I really appreciated it. The chat was good. I definitely take some things from it myself, and I'm sure everybody listening as well.
Good. I just hope I answered the questions.
Oh yeah, definitely spot on.
Yeah, good. I appreciate
the
opportunity, fellas. Yeah, no, thank you for your time. Cheers, fellas.
Yeah, appreciate it. Look after yourself. Yeah.
You too. See you later,
Thanks,
guys.
Dan. Bye-bye.
Bye.